All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. Bienvenue. C'est la dernière session de la conférence et merci à tous d'être toujours ici. Nous allons parler maintenant de l'immigration aux États-Unis, mais pas juste les États-Unis, on va aller un petit peu plus large que ça. So for this very last session, this is going to be the cherry on the sundae. I assure you. We had some food metaphors going on earlier today. Or, you know, actually now that, since we're in Montreal, this is going to be the gravy on the poutine. That's what it's going to be. There we go. The slide up there says the United States or USA. We've already commented that our flag is kind of small here. But we're also going to go beyond the United States. The United States often gets a little bit too much room, probably, in conversations. So we have experts on the United States, but we also have an expert on Canada so that we can re-engage with some of this comparative discussion. And we have an expert on Australia and beyond, because, you know, there's many other countries of immigration that are also doing important things related to migration. So this is really going to be a global conversation, I hope. My name is Irene Blumrad. I'm at the University of California, Berkeley, but I'm actually alumni of McGill, so it's a great pleasure. I have an undergraduate degree in political science here at McGill and an MA in sociology. So I'm really thrilled to be back, and I want to thank Danielle for inviting me to help moderate this panel. Let me introduce the speakers, and then we're going to get right into our conversation. I'm going to start at my far left with Jeanne Batalova. She is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and especially for any of the students in the room, I highly recommend MPI as a source of data and information, especially about the United States, but also about the world. They have amazing synopsis and overviews that are super helpful. And Jeanne is actually the manager of the Migration Data Hub, which is an incredible resource. It's an online resource that provides access to the latest facts, statistics, and maps covering the United States, as well as global data on migration and immigrant integration. And I actually make my students go to the Data Hub and use it for some of their assignments. Excellent. So thank you, Jeanne. Her areas of expertise include the impacts of immigration on society and labor markets, social and economic mobility of first and second generation youth and young adults, and the policies and practices regulating immigration and integration of highly skilled workers and foreign students in the United States and other countries. Then, right beside Jeanne, we have Shannon Gleason. Shannon is a professor of labor relations, law, and history at the Cornell ILR School, where she is also currently serving as chair. Her research includes a focus on immigrant workers, labor organizing, unions, undocumented migration, and the enforcement of worker rights. Shannon is one of the most prolific and hardest workers that I know, so she has dozens of projects. One of them that I will just raise up for you is a project that is being funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, being done with Else de Grauw, which examines the local implementation of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program in 3 metropolitan regions in the United States. After Shannon, we have Anna Boucher, who I've decided to make francophone for this panel. She is currently an associate professor in public policy and comparative politics at the University of Sydney. She has worked on immigration issues including skilled migration, migrants in the labor market, migration and unemployment effects, migration and diversity, population politics, and immigration data. Now, her academic and scholarly work is extremely impressive, but what is also really impressive is her applied work, and she is a frequent media commentator and advisor to Australian and international government agencies on the topics of migration and demographics. And then immediately to my left, notice there's no right here, immediately to my left is Rupa Banerjee, who is Associate Professor of Human Resources Management and Organizational Behavior at Toronto Metropolitan University, and she also holds a Canada Research Chair of Economic Inclusion, Employment, and Entrepreneurship of Canada's Immigrants. Her research examines employment outcomes of newcomers, a topic on which she has published extensively, and her current research focuses on the role of post-secondary institutions and employers on the migration and integration of temporary residents and immigrants in Canada. And this might be of particular interest to some people in the room, to the extent that some of you might be in this status of student, employee, etc. All right, I think we're just going to get right into it. We already heard from our previous speaker how the United States' system of immigration, which if we want to divide it into sort of economic migration, family reunification, or refugee humanitarian migration, is overwhelmingly biased or leans towards family reunification, but at the same time, many of those family members are working in the labor market, so that the line and the distinction between economic and family migration might exist in visas, but not in the workplace. So with an eye to economic immigration writ broadly, we want to first talk about some of the main differences between Canada, the United States, and then Australia and beyond in terms of economic migrants. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with Jeanne, and then we're going to move on to Rupa, and then we're going to move on to Anna. So Jeanne.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, for bringing together this excellent group, and thank you, all of you, for coming here. I know that we stand between you and the reception, so we'll hope we'll make it as informative for you as possible. So in terms of U.S. immigration, I think it's really important to highlight kind of a few philosophical maybe differences between how Canada selects economic migrants versus how the U.S. is doing. The United States essentially sets caps on everyone who can come. So it's more of a kind of restriction. No one can come beyond that cap. Whereas in Canada, at least with regard to economic migration, there are targets. So we would like to bring as many people as X. Right, so to me, there is a philosophical difference in just in this element. Employers are the primary drivers behind economic migration in the United States. If employers found a worker and they're willing to sponsor that person for an employment-based green card or for temporary visa, they pretty much rule that game, whereas in Canada there is a points-based system where a job offer is important, but so are other characteristics that the government chooses based on research, based on observations of how well these people are doing in the Canadian economy, and calibrates the number of points and the types of characteristics that these points are assigned. So job offer at some point was not really on the table in the points-based system. Prioritization was given to age and education and the types of profession that people, types of degrees, but with time, the job offer gained prominence. In the United States, that's not really, the government plays more of a role of initially set the caps and then processing the applications. I think there is another big difference in how often something changes in the U.S. Versus Canadian immigration system. As far as I know, there are annual targets. There is a calibration in the system in Canada, whereas the last time the U.S. immigration system as a whole kind of systematically, holistically was revised in 1990 as a result of long-term discussions. No one was happy with the system, but it was, at least there was a revision since the last time it was done in 1965. So we are really long overdue for a revision of U.S. immigration system, and so far for various reasons that were already touched upon and will expand more, there hasn't been much of the movement. One important area to highlight, I think Pia mentioned in her presentation, that it's really hard to move between temporary and permanent migration. There are caps for highly skilled immigrants who come through H-1B visa at 85,000. There is a cap for less skilled but nonetheless important non-agricultural workers visa at 66,000. But for them to get through to the permanent immigration, so they can have full rights and opportunities, including much easier to switch employers if need to be, is extremely difficult. The waiting times are very, very long, and that raises challenges for families of these workers, because in most cases they can either not bring their spouses at all, or their spouses cannot work. Their children age out of eligibility even though when their parents 10 years or 15 years later finally get their green card, the kids age out by turning 21, so they're no longer covered by the visa. So we're talking about the family separation just by how the system was designed. So it's, from the structural point of view, it's very hard to maneuver and for the system to reflect the current economic, social, and other needs and priorities.
Okay, so thanks so much, Jean. So I feel like as you were speaking, some of the points you were making were kind of exact polar opposites of what's happening in Canada. So of course we do have the point system, and which has been around since 1967, but since 2015 we are managing our immigration system through Express Entry, which is technically a online management portal, but in reality actually introduced or really solidified a lot of changes to our immigration system that have been kind of in place from the beginning of the 21st century. And some of this has been kind of talked about a little bit in yesterday's panel on Canada, but as we have moved from a one-step to a two-step immigration process, I think it's really important to understand why. So when we first had our points-based system, of course, there were a lot of changes taking place in terms of what we gave points for. So initially, points were really given to occupation-specific factors. So it wasn't really about general human capital, it was about specific human capital. And what we found there is that we were always kind of two steps behind the labor market and labor market demand. So in response, the government changed the point system to actually give more points to general human capital, high levels of education, because studies found, well, really highly educated people, they're flexible. They can switch into a different field if they need to. So not surprisingly, that increased our level of education of our immigrants. So now we had very, very highly educated immigrants, but their actual outcomes, their ability to find work, their ability to actually get jobs in those fields, it didn't really improve. So the high levels of education of Canada's immigrants kind of became a double-edged sword, right? On one hand, they're educated, perhaps flexible, able to move around where they need to go. But on the other hand, the problem of credential devaluation and brain waste, we could call it, really became a big problem. And that has not just economic implications, but it has a lot of psychological implications and implications for the family and for the community as well. So in response to that, we kind of moved away again from this general human capital model to a, once again, more demand-driven kind of immigration system in which, first we brought in the provincial nominee program, which really allowed employers to sponsor temporary foreign workers who are already in the country and gave them a lot of points so they were able to come in. And over time, as we move into 2015 and the introduction of Express Entry, we have not just the provincial nominee program, but also the Canadian Experience Class, which again gives this preference for people who are already either studying or working in Canada. So, there's kind of like initial beginning stage of focusing on specific human capital or demand-driven kind of immigration to a move towards more general human capital, which brought problems. And now we've moved back towards a much more demand-driven immigration process, in which it's true that having an employer job offer is not a necessary part of your application, but it certainly gives you points. And most importantly, having previous Canadian work experience really determines whether a person is going to be able to get into Canada. Our latest census data showed that about a third 33%, I think it was, of our immigrants coming in the last 5 years have come in through the provincial nominee program. So they got points for having a PNP, and so, or a provincial nomination. And so that really shows that we really are operating in what I would call like a hybrid system now, where we're not really a point system, a merit-based point system anymore, but we're trying to incorporate some of these aspects of the American, sort of employer-centric system into our points-based program. So overall, I think that the other point that Jean made is the difficulty in the US of changing things. In Canada, it's the exact opposite. Things change like every week. It's hard to keep up with the changes. And it's not just hard for us scholars, it's hard for the immigrants and their application processes. So, a new initiative, a new pilot project, a new change in the points is introduced all the time. And so just as not being able to change things has huge problems, having changes happen at a breakneck speed is also just as disorienting and difficult to keep up with. An example of this would be the fact that express entry, when it was first introduced, it was really touted as being demand-driven immigration. So employers were going to play this wonderful, huge role and kind of select immigrants from this pool, this job market that was going to be created with an online job portal, et cetera. And what we quickly found is that employers were not actually choosing people from that job portal at all, and they really weren't playing this pivotal role in the immigration system that perhaps it was advertised to be. And so the points for having a job offer went from something like 500 to 50 if it wasn't a senior level management position. So to me, it felt like a very quiet change where they didn't really advertise that we went from this very demand-driven system to pretty much kind of the point system again, in a very kind of quick and not advertised kind of way. So, whereas we really do focus on economic immigration in Canada, there are these kind of really interesting peculiarities that on one hand, we're going to get into this with the next questions, but on one hand, we bring in these very highly skilled immigrants and we have really positive views towards immigration from the public, but we also have these really, really ingrained problems that I would love to kind of talk about in the next questions. Yeah.
Anna, another point system.
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to forget about Australia, isn't it? Like, we're on the opposite side of the world. But Australia, as a percentage of the population, has one of the highest immigration intake rates of any democracy, and has a very strong economic focus. So it is a good case study. I think the biggest single difference is that in the US, it is largely a legislative-driven process, and therefore the system is very rigid, as Pia mentioned in her keynote. Australia, like Canada, has a highly agile system, not all of which is done through legislative reform, often through administrative and procedural measures that are, as in Canada, quite opaque and fast-sped, which means that we have a lot more innovation in Australia, but that innovation doesn't always work very well. An example is the Global Talent Visa, which was meant to focus on STEMs occupations, is now essentially being scrapped by the new Labor government. So I think in Australia it's more agile. We have the most complex visa system in the world. We established in the Impala project that I did with colleagues from Harvard, LSE and Luxembourg. It is the most complex and difficult to interpret, which is challenging for migrants, as Rupert just said. But then there's also a lot of similarities. So Australia has adopted a lot of temporary migration, and we just saw in the presentation on the US that in the US also temporary economic migration eclipses permanent. We have many of the same kind of visas. They might not have this, they might not be called H1AB or H1B, but they are essentially the same thing. They're a form of agricultural visa. They're a form of low-skilled labour visa. So that's similar. And yes, targets, levels, quotas, you could say that they're very different, but our levels are also set by Parliament in the budget process, and they're often not met, and they are very rarely exceeded in the permanent stream of economic migration. So I'd say, yes, there are some differences in terms of the speed of policy change, but in terms of the composition of within the economic stream, there's actually a lot of similarities between Australia and the US.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the agricultural workers, and I think one of the things that was really interesting in Pia's presentation was how during COVID, the one category of migrant that continued to enter, if not increase, were the H-2As, agricultural workers. And I think that's a group that, at least in the public discourse in the United States, we don't talk that often about. And then we've also used terms such as one-step, two-step migration. But I think, as has been made clear by both Jeanne and Pia, in the United States you could say there's like a no-step migration system, because there's just no way for some people to enter the migration system if you don't have a family member, or even if you do have a family member, depending on the country you come from, you might be waiting 20 years for your name to be called to the queue. So this raises all kinds of questions about other statuses, temporary status, those living undocumented. And so I'm going to start with Shannon and ask if you can give us a sense of sort of the scope of migration in these other streams of migration and life situations, consequences. Who are these people?
Great. Thank you so much. I just want to also just take a moment to thank the organizers for the conference and the hotel workers, many of whom are foreign-born as well, and so they're the ones who allow us to make this convening happen. So I want to start with a way of thinking about this more as, instead of different categories, really what our colleague Ming-Shu Chen refers to as a citizenship spectrum. And the reason I think it's better to think of it that way, especially in the US context, is that people are often falling in and out of these categories. At the far end, you have the undocumented population, which at one point was up to 12 million. I think now somewhere between 10.5 to 11 million. They constitute about almost 5% of the private sector workforce, all the way over to naturalized citizens. Altogether, the foreign-born in the United States constitute on the order of 17 to 19% of the workforce. In the middle, you have a whole bunch of variation, what some authors, including Cecilia Menjivar and Lacey Abrego, refer to as this area of kind of liminal legality. And that includes, perhaps we can think of the temporary foreign workforce, which we mentioned, which includes groups like the H-2A workers, which are agricultural workers, and the H-2B, which are also seasonal workers in the non-agricultural sector. Together in fiscal year 2021, those were really not as many as you would think, far fewer percentage-wise of the immigrant flow than in Canada, somewhere in the order of about 200,000 H-2A, 160,000 H-2B. Altogether, our temporary foreign worker program is only about 2 million. If we include the entire alphabet soup. But then you also have this whole other category of temporary immigrants who have workplace authorization that get to that status through either humanitarian status, not quite visas, like our temporary status protected status program, but then everyday forms of discretion at the level of the executive, sometimes of Congress. And that is something that legal scholar Jeff Heron refers to as a non-status status, right? And it's this very liminal space. And I just want to, back up and say that it's not only that these temporary, including the temporary foreign worker, as well as these non-status statuses are temporary, but and they don't have really a jump point to the permanent route, with very few exception. But it's also the case that even though we have this very large family-based migration program, it is blocked for many workers or immigrants who fall into these areas of bars. And so if you have unauthorized entry, which is the case for a lot of our Latin American migrants, even though they've been here for decades, including folks in my own community, they can never jump the line over to that. And so our last mass legalization program was in 1986. We're about 4 decades overdue. And so in terms of the percentage of, or the impact of these workers on the economy, I think we can think through it in terms of substitutes and complements, the way our economist colleagues think of it. But the way I really like to think of it in my own work is more from the lens of immigrant precarity. And we might ask, what role do immigrants play for the US economy? But I also like to think through the role that the work site and work in general plays for immigration enforcement and broader mechanisms of really state terror for many of these local communities. And so I think as we're thinking through this, it's both the case that many of these groups are undocumented, but there's all these other categories of temporariness, which I think we're going to talk a lot about today, which fosters much of the immigrant precarity on many of the mechanisms of labor standards enforcement, which are in complete contradiction and the crosshairs in terms of how we're doing labor compliance along with immigration enforcement. And so I think that's a big part of our conversation today. Just a few things to think through. The largest percentage of folks who are dying from occupational fatalities are Latino or Hispanic or Latin American, whichever term you use, foreign-born workers, right? And so the risk factor of being immigrant, and particularly racialized immigrants, is borne out in the data. And we can talk through the empirical challenges of kind of capturing that. But I think that needs to be part of the conversation as well, which is not just the impact on local economies, but also the impact on these enforcement systems on the well-being of these workers and their families.
Thank you. Jean, I know you've been working with H-1B and international students and sort of, I guess, the high human capital migrants, but who are still caught up in this labyrinthian system of temporary status and then also maybe undocumented status. Would you be willing to talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So we already mentioned H-1B visa, which is given essentially to highly skilled immigrant workers. It's been a very interesting program, but like all others, it is caught in so much in the politics of immigration debates. So even though there is a cap of 85,000, which is met every single year before, sometimes within a week, sometimes within a couple of months. That cap has not been increased since 2004. So again, there is the current system is out of touch with what the economy needs. It's also an interesting system because it's if we look at the composition of workers, they are about 70% of these visas are taken by the IT sector, so the computer-related occupations. The number of petitions grows every year. 75% of H-1B recipients are from one country, from India. The next two groups from China and Canada account for significantly smaller share, 12 and 1%. So it's a highly concentrated, it's a visa that gives priority to essentially one industry and essentially to one origin group. And then this population has very difficult time moving to other options like getting a green card. International students, again, both the highly skilled immigration is important for all sorts of reasons to the economic well-being as well as to the advances in research and science. There was an estimate that more than a third of all Nobel Prize winners who were from the United States in chemistry, physics, and medicine were immigrants. And if we add children of immigrants, that number is even higher. So there is a substantial contribution that former international students or highly skilled immigrants who came on H-1B visas who work in companies as well as research labs are making, both in terms of breakthroughs that are warranted the Nobel Prize, as well as filing for patents. There is also a study that shows that immigrants and immigrant origin patent holders file more patents, sorry, not patent holders, immigrants file more patents than the US born. So that stream and the international students, I know for Canada and Australia, international students became this kind of designed and very desired immigrant. It is an important stream for the US, both in terms of kind of future migrants as well as the efforts to project the US the power of U.S. education as well as U.S. diplomacy abroad. A lot of current government leaders across the world used to be students in the United States. But the numbers have been dropping, or at least not growing as fast as they used to. Okay, of course, the pandemic decreased the flows everywhere, but also the rhetoric and policies and politics have a great impact. And if we look at the period during the Trump administration, the number of new international students dropped significantly in response to the rhetoric, as well as tightened rules about who is eligible to apply for a student visa.
And Anna, I have to admit that I have no clue whether Australia has a large undocumented population or the percentage of people living in liminal legality.
It's growing.
It's growing.
It's growing, yeah.
Like from 1 to 2?
It's like a state secret. But a lot of researchers suggest that it's growing for a variety of reasons. I mean, more broadly on the green card, I think that we consider the green card to be the sort of pinnacle of migration status. There's movies about it. In Australia, it would be called the independent points-tested visa. That is now the minority of visa access in the world. Justin Guest and myself in our book Crossroads demonstrate that temporary migration now comprises the bulk of migration. Temporary economic migration comprises the bulk of migration across the globe in the 51 countries we look at, which include countries across Western Europe, Latin America, the Gulf, and places like Australia. So very few people are getting that pure points-tested visa now. It's either tied to an employer, it's temporary, it's not two-step. In Australia, it's about 2.5-step. Increasingly, people need to be on about 3 visas before they get residency, if they stay at all. And then you've got student migration, as has been mentioned. We have this very complex system of post-study migration in Australia, and a massive use of what's known as bridging visas, which is when the government says we don't want people to be undocumented, we can't get them to leave because of border closures or some other reason. We're going to give them a 3-month visa, then we'll renew it again, then we'll renew it again. And that subcategory of bridging visas is growing massively. Now, my concern about the bridging visas, and I don't think I'm the only immigration expert in Australia thinking this, is that what happens when they stop renewing the bridging visas and the people don't want to leave? Then you have an emerging undocumented population. There's also a risk of an emerging undocumented population, not just in Australia, but many countries with asylum claims that are bogus. And this is not to suggest that most asylum claims are bogus, but some are. There have been avenues of entry into Australia of migrants where 99% of people from that country's applications are rejected, and they often go and enter into farm work and others, and they suffer underpayment. So there's that category, which is at risk. And I believe in the future there could also be the category of post-study visa holders, because we were just talking at lunch, there's this more people studying and then staying post-study than there are permanent positions for them. And sure, some of them will go and marry, some of them may put in a legitimate asylum-based claim, some of them may go on to further study, but some of them won't have avenues, and they will also not want to return. And so I see Australia and maybe Canada, not as much of an expert on Canada, New Zealand, being in a position that the US was several decades ago. And I think we have really considerable risks that will grow with pressures like climate change and global inequality, in terms of meaning that we will have a population emerge where we won't necessarily be able to repatriate them, and then we will face the same challenges that the US has faced.
And Rupa, I want to invite you to bring in sort of a Canadian perspective, because we spoke yesterday about home care workers, we've talked about ag workers. What's your sense of where we are in Canada in terms of irregular migration, temporary, these 2.5 steps, 3 steps, however many steps it takes?
Yeah, so first I want to challenge Anna on whether Canada's temporary migration visa system is any less complicated than Australia's. I mean, we have absolutely dozens and dozens of different streams. So just to give you a sense, I mean, traditionally, there's been kind of this view that the temporary foreign worker programs are for low skill or low wage occupations, and they were classified under temporary foreign worker program. But of course, starting in the early 2000s, that kind of got split up into temporary foreign worker programs, so TFWP, and IMP, the International Mobility Program. And that's really in response to a lot of advocates and researchers kind of decrying the exploitation and abuse of temporary foreign workers in home care and in agricultural work and other kinds of service work, and particularly service work actually, because a lot of restaurant workers and others were being brought in as temporary foreign workers and very clearly exploited. So in response, the government kind of not shut down, but lessened the visas in the temporary foreign workers program, and instead started advocating for IMP, which was the non-labor market tested visa stream for temporary workers. And traditionally, we think of these as high-skilled workers, but actually, if you look at the kinds of jobs people do on IMP visas, it's truly variable. So there are high-skilled jobs there are lower-skilled and lower-wage jobs as well. They don't require a labor market impact assessment, and we also don't tie them to an employer, so that's good. But on the other hand, we don't know what they're doing either. We don't know anything about their labor market conditions, whether they're being exploited. We don't really know anything about them. And the other traditional view has been that temporary foreign worker programs don't have pathways to permanent residence, while IMP programs do. And this is also somewhat not completely true either. So there's been some research recently that's shown that actually, there are certain temporary foreign worker streams that have been able to transition to permanent residence through provincial nominee programs in particular. And this was driven a lot in the kind of 2010 to 2016 period by Live-In Caregiver program, which actually had this pathway to permanent residence through advocates and people pushing for it. But even those who do have pathways to permanent residence, there are numerous barriers that get in the way. So I want to also stress the growth of the international student group in Canada. I mean, we talk about this all the time, right? So we were a little bit late to the game in terms of trying to recruit and get money from international students. But now we're in the game, and we are really, really trying to recruit as many international students as we can. And the growth in the international student population has also been fueled by this view that Canada allows international students to become permanent residents. But when you actually look at the data, only about 3 in 10 actually become permanent residents. So while the number of international students is uncapped and the number of postgraduate work permits that come with it is uncapped, the number of actual permanent resident spots is capped, right? So we don't have enough streams for those folks to actually transition to permanent resident status. So just because in theory or in written policy there are pathways doesn't mean that a lot of folks actually get those pathways available to them. In terms of undocumented population, we don't have a lot of data on it, and the understanding from what I read is there's perhaps 200,000 in Canada, but I'm not sure how accurate that is. Again, I think just like Anna said, given the fact that a lot of these temporary foreign worker streams, which continue to grow significantly each year, are uncapped, and yet the number of positions to become permanent residents are capped, there's not kind of this keeping of pace between these two things, which leaves vulnerability for people to become undocumented. But also, leads to the real worry that there's just exploitation, period. Even if they go home, back to their home country, that doesn't make it any better. And so, how do we view these migrants as just kind of economic units or as people, right? So I think that's where I'll end it for now.
I'm going to do what my panelists are going to hate. I'm going to go slightly off script because we did share questions in advance, but I really want to follow up on something that was raised by all of you, which is the costs of systems that don't give a sense of permanent pathway and that there's all of these off-ramps that you can fall off. And given that at least part of the goal of this panel is to learn from other cases, I want to ask Shannon, what can we learn from the United States about the human costs of systems that shut people out of, say, green cards and at least a pathway to citizenship, either through undocumented, living as an undocumented migrant right from the start, so as a visa overstayer or as someone who crossed the border, or someone who came and held a visa, was trying their best, and then fell out of status, back into status, out of status. You mentioned, just briefly in passing, some of the labor issues. In the United States, labor rights are given to all workers, irrespective of their legal status in general. But what's it really like on the ground? And if you want to speak more generally to what can we learn in Canada from what happens when immigration systems fail?
Sure. I mean, I think there's at least three ways to answer that. One is at the level of the worker themselves. And so we can think about what are the forms of precarity that they're facing, certainly through lost wages, but also the other kind of areas of labor standards enforcement include being subject to discrimination and harassment, occupational safety and health, as well as at the extreme point, fatalities. Now, that's a problem for the worker themselves. Obviously, we don't want to see that happening just from a human rights perspective, but it's also a serious problem for the regulatory institutions that have a direct interest in making sure that employer compliance with these labor standards is met. And that's because, and this is the realization that the US labor movement came to about 2 decades too late, that if you allow the race to the bottom for the undocumented workforce, you're also putting in danger the workers that are standing right next to them on the assembly floor. And so from an institutional standpoint, this is challenging, particularly because in the United States, as I alluded, there's this kind of combined area of what my colleague refers to as employment. So the immigration law, and particularly the enforcement aspect of it that is tied into the work site. And so we have all sorts of different mechanisms for facilitating removals, deportation, whatever you want to call it, but the work site is one among them. And so the I-9 process through employer sanctions allows for not only the kind of large spectacle raids that we saw, especially under the Bush administration, but also the much more effective, some would argue, kind of silent audits of, I would say, the current administration as well as the Obama administration. And so what that means is that you're handing employers greater power. And so this becomes a problem for labor regulation more broadly. I think many of my colleagues here have also looked at the impact if we kind of broaden the unit of analysis, not simply on the worker themselves, but a lot of these undocumented workers or those who are falling in and out of status live in what we call mixed status families. And that includes both the parents of naturalized and green card holding children who would have, under one of Obama's proposals in 2014, close to, I think, 4.5 to 5 million of them would have benefited from some sort of legalization. Those children, we know, also are impacted both from the lack of access to particular poverty or welfare state benefits, but also there's kind of long-term implications in terms of their parents' ability to engage with government and other entities that would help improve their lives. And then I think that there's kind of community level effects in terms of how we do things of, what you write a lot about in terms of civic engagement and democracy. Many cities, and we'll get to this in a second, many cities have innovated on how to create additional panels for voice for residents, for example, on school boards and all the rest. But there's kind of broad implications, especially for Western democracies, for, having a growing population that is shut out formally from avenues of voice. Now, that's not to say that those individuals aren't engaging, and there's plenty of evidence that they are, but it's a kind of a systemic cutting out from those forms of influence. And that should be of interest to all of us, particularly because those tend to be overrepresented in not only underprivileged, but communities of color.
So let's pick up on that, the fact that millions and millions of residents of the United States cannot vote in the formal electoral system, so have to make their voices heard otherwise in the streets and social movements, unions maybe. And I mean, Jean, you said, the United States has not had sort of a large-scale overhaul of its immigration system since 1990. And that's a long time given all the different changes. And Shannon, you just alluded to the fact that even if when even if under the Bush administration there might have been workplace raids that were very prominent, it's not to say that Democratic administrations such as the Biden and Obama administrations also did not do lots of immigration enforcement, including lots of deportation, and in this case the Obama administration. So it seems like there's both some kind of almost partisan agreement that we're just all doing enforcement, but also partisan gridlock to do anything different. Jean, do you want to speak a little bit about why the US system is so frozen? Like, what is going on politically?
So how much time do we have?
Yeah, I don't know. You're going to solve that. You're going to answer that question in 2 minutes.
Okay. Solve this, right? It seems that there is a consensus in the United States that the immigration system is broken, but there is absolutely no consensus on how to fix it. Just like if we take one prime example, recently the government announced that there were 2.5 million encounters at the border, which means that if the immigrants were either apprehended and immediately deported or apprehended and placed in detention. So there is a perennial kind of story of a border as a crisis. So it's very hard, it would be very hard to come up with a consensus on what would it mean to have border that is not in crisis. So just kind of one example, and examples like that can be given on how many family immigrants should be admitted versus employment-based immigrants. Shall we continue with that? Because there are strong advocacy groups on either the side to keep the family immigration as is. It's sacred, do not touch it, do not decrease it. And that there is a strong lobbying side saying that we need more of economic and skills-based migration. The refugee arrivals is another big, very controversial issue. The president, in consultation with Congress, has the right to increase or decrease, and for the most part, the Democrat presidents were increasing, or at least not, or keeping at the same level. And then President Trump came in, or Donald Trump came to the White House and brought the refugee program essentially to a grinding halt with 15,000 allowed to come. After a year or two of that, even now the president allows for 65,000 or 125,000 per year of refugees. There is no system that can process because it was decimated. So like one lesson to learn is that with one person or one administration can make long-lasting changes very, very quickly. So the Congress is the only body that makes essentially the big changes, and there were multiple attempts throughout 2000s and then in 2010s to change immigration through bipartisan efforts. They all went to nowhere because in the end, we were like literally that close to passing immigration reform. In the end, the forces that pull apart are greater than the forces that are bringing the groups together, and they are very, very tied to the sense of national identity. With the European panel talked a lot about that. It has to do with changing demographics and the perception that the life and the country as we used to be is slipping away, and we'll just hold on to it with the death grip as much as possible. So all of these immigration kind of overlaps with so many other areas: the national security, social, national identity, economics, access to benefits, the perception that the pie is limited, it's not growing. So if your children get educational support through English language classes, that means that my child will not have the same amount of dollars to obtain additional skills. So very controversial. The sides are very entrenched, and it seems that they became even more entrenched than it used to be in the past. So it's to the point that even with a small provision, immigrant-related provision cannot make it through Congress. And when the presidents have executive authority through administrative action to initiate a program or to close the program, when that happens, usually legal suits are follow, and all of these programs are embroiled in years-long battles, like Shannon mentioned, for DACA immigrants and temporary protected status holders. All of these programs are facing legal challenges.
Shannon, do you want to add in about the politics of immigration in the United States right now?
Sure, and I think your original question is, why is it so contentious? Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to think about it. Certainly, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, immigrants themselves get scapegoated in ways that I think really are a foil for other deeper resentments. And you yourself have done kind of work on looking at how public opinion shifts depending on how you frame the question of immigration. But I also think that part of the issue is that the way in which we have, at least in the United States, deal with poverty reduction and deal with the kind of winnowing welfare state is that the quote-unquote benefits of immigration are really concentrated at the federal level, and the costs in the local debates are really happening at the state and local level. Now, that's an overgeneralization, but really when we have some of these debates around the costs of immigration, these are really being felt at the level of the school board. And when you have a disproportionately, in the case of low-wage immigration, low-wage population in need, who bears the brunt of that just by the way we have constructed a welfare state that's been devolved to state and local governments is at the state and local level, so that the federal government can tout things like these are net benefits at the level of Medicare and Social Security, which is contested, but state and localities, which have been tasked disproportionately with dealing with our completely non-functional healthcare system or dealing with questions around other forms of poverty reduction, those populations are really being seen at the local level. I mean, I do think that there is a role to play in terms of racism, which you also posed to us to think about, and the role that kind of these racialized migrants play. I do want to say, though, that increasingly a lot of the work by political scientists have shown that migrants themselves, including documented and sometimes even undocumented migrants, have a very large range of opinions on what reform should look like, how open the border should be. So I think, as we see right now happening in South Texas and the areas where the GOP or the Republican Party is kind of investing some of their time and efforts, it's not the case that this is a uniformly white European conversation. And so, the way we talk about immigration at the federal level or in the national conversation often doesn't reflect the realities on the ground. And that's part of that disconnect very much is reflected, I think, in those resentments. But I also think, not just in the United States, but in other places, the conversations around immigration are framed, especially in the United States, as a domestic matter, as opposed to a foreign policy or bilateral relations in some cases. Issue. And so that means that we start to reify some certain priority areas around immigration that avoid some of the, in some ways, harder conversations in terms of what someone would label broadly as kind of the right to stay home. Like, what are the push factors? What are the questions of displacement? And that becomes also a big disconnect between the reality of migrants. And we certainly see this right now in the crisis at the southern border. But how we as a country talk about our own role in some of those push factors, I think, is a much harder and deeper conversation to be had.
And it's really interesting to hear you say about how in the United States, the concerns around immigration are felt much more on the municipal or the local or state level, whereas yesterday with our panel of Quebec, it seemed more that the provinces in Canada were sort of competing for immigrants in a very different dynamic. So something to think through. You mentioned, let's go beyond sort of domestic U.S. politics. So I want to ask about now the extent to which U.S. immigration politics, or just U.S. politics, period, impact other countries both as examples to follow, but also examples not to follow. And I think particularly of the Canadian case, where I think there's a strong element of Canadian nationalism, which is not being American. And so there's this sort of constant, we're not American, and that can be for good or ill. But I want to ask both Rupa and Anna about, from your research, from your experience, either with policymakers or even on the ground in terms of social movements, what effects do you see, or what influences do you see from U.S. immigration policies and politics here in Canada or outside?
Yeah, so first of all, I think Canada's moved towards a more demand-driven immigration system. I'm not sure if it's kind of directly influenced by the American very employer-based system, but it could be argued that we have had a largely nation-building economic image of immigration, and then in the last couple of decades have really moved towards a more demand-driven system, which is what they have in the U.S. So in that sense, we are kind of emulating some aspects of economic immigration policy in the U.S. In terms of kind of the rhetoric, I think you're right that Canadians pride themselves on not being American, and so we kind of watch the train wreck from up here and feel very smug that we are not like that. And so when Environics has a survey on what we think of immigrants, sometimes I wonder how many people are answering with some favorability, some bias on answering in a way that really upholds the Canadian image of being nice and being favorable towards diversity, et cetera. Because when you actually look on the ground outside of the big cities, the picture isn't quite what Environics shows. And although employers are the ones that are always demanding immigrants and more immigration, when you actually go to how many of them are hiring immigrants in high-skill, high-wage jobs, they're not. They're hiring them in low-wage, low-skill jobs. So there's a real disconnect there. So I think that there are some indirect impacts both on the policy and both also on kind of Canadians' imagination of who they are as an immigrant nation. On the other hand, I think the fact that we have really moved from a permanent immigration system to a temporary immigration system, also very much kind of emulating the American model in many ways. And then on the other hand, I think as much as I say we pride ourselves on not being American, we just had this freedom convoy and this kind of backlash against a lot of this kind of idea of us as diversity-loving Canadians. So I think it's there. I think that there's this kind of this push and this pull of us kind of standing in opposition to what the U.S. represents in terms of immigration and diversity. But then on the other hand, if you really look a little bit deeper, there's a lot of kind of influence on how people actually talk at the kitchen table that permeates just as much here as in the U.S.
And Anna, what do you see in terms of policy diffusions or impacts?
So it's a bit controversial, but I actually think like about 12 years ago I was shortlisted for a Fulbright that I didn't get, where I proposed that the US had a lot to learn from Australia in terms of our use of bureaucratic centralisation and policy instruments to achieve policy change. And I would suggest to you that a lot of the policy change that has occurred in the US since has actually operated through those mechanisms. So I think actually the agility of the Australian system is a source of inspiration for the US potentially. Undocumented migration obviously is emerging as an issue in Australia, as I mentioned. I think civil society in Australia is starting to learn from the US in terms of the way civil society has pushed for addressing questions of wage theft and criminalising serious forms of wage underpayment. a lot of that language and activism is inspired by US movements. The work that I've done recently on underpayment and other forms of workplace violations that's coming out in my book, Patterns of Exploitation, and I was in California doing research there. The Australian government's very interested in that, and the different and in some ways more radical ways that the Californian system has managed wage underpayment and enforcement of those infringements than in Australia. So I think there's a development there. And yeah, what you said about temporary migration is true. I mean, we don't know if it came from inspiration on the H1B or just there's this attractiveness and almost addictiveness on the part of government to temporary migration because of the economic benefits and at least at first instance, the lack of economic costs. But certainly the US has a longer history with its H1B than we have with our analogous 457 TSS visa in Australia. So it's possible that it was inspired. And more broadly, I guess the main thing that Australia has drawn is an inspiration from the US in its practice of multiculturalism, of diversity. It was faster than Australia to get rid of race-based selection. Australian policymakers were inspired by the Hart-Celler Act in their abolition of race-based selection in the 70s, whereas the US did it in the 60s. A lot of the race discrimination legislation that came through was inspired by the civil rights movement. So yeah, historically we've perhaps been more inspired than the current day.
I'm actually going to ask Shannon, do you sense that there's any cross-border Canada-US partnerships either in labour organising and or around Dreamer or pro-immigrant social movement activism where Canadians are drawing on American patterns?
Yeah, I think I can speak less probably to what's happening with immigrant youth. I'm less connected to that. But I do know that Canada is a poster child for what not to do with temporary foreign worker programs. I think it is a real reality check for those of us who, you know, in the labor movement in particular, who would otherwise want to increase guest worker programs. And I think there's a real cautionary tale there that advocates have elevated. On the other hand, I think that for labor relations scholars, it's also a real poster child for over-lionizing unionization as the singular solution to immigrant worker precarity. So I think the kind of primary union that has done a lot of this cross-border work is the United Food and Commercial Workers, who have an important role to play here with your seasonal agricultural worker program. And this international has been able to take a lot of the lessons that it's learned trying to organize with guest workers in Canada and apply them not only to the organizing happening here and there in the United States, but also in Mexico. But I think also we see, more importantly, probably beyond the unions, and this is work that I've done with my colleague Xochitl Bada, is looking at these transnational advocacy networks that have emerged among migrant advocates who are thinking through migration in a more regional manner. And for the work that the legal advocates are doing in terms of strategic litigation, these guest worker programs are particularly important because they are the area where they've really been able to bring some of these cases, perhaps more symbolically than in any other way, to really elevate the obligations that Mexico, for example, has to their diaspora, to their immigrant workforce, through the labor side accords of the North American Free Trade Agreement, now USMCA. And so that becomes really important from like a legal strategy and becomes really important at points of renegotiation, as we saw with the NAFTA negotiations. We didn't get everything we wanted, but groups like CDM, Centro de Derechos de los Migrantes, which focuses with workers both in Canada and the United States, but also thinking through the rights of workers who are returned back to Mexico and who have ongoing wage theft disputes, for example, and also addressing some of the recruitment fraud on the part of labor brokers who've built an entire industry out of defrauding and putting migrants in debt. And so the question is, whose responsibility is that? Is it just a market of migration that's emerged, or does the sending state and the receiving country have kind of a joint obligation to that? And I think that's been a powerful, even if not as widespread, tactic from the organizing standpoint. I will say that on the student front, there's been just a lot of conversation on the ground with students who are who no longer have a pathway to DACA, that functionally is no longer a program that exists, and many of us at the university level are trying to think through what that means. But then also, what does this category of workers who very well may lose their work permit and are in these kind of high human capital work settings, like, do they now become cosmopolitans or global workers? What is the option for them? And I think in a lot of these groups, there's serious conversation about how to facilitate their movement into other labor markets. And that in some ways might seem unrealistic, but there's serious conversation at least students in my orbit are having. And it's a privileged one to be having, but one that certainly at least a few that I'm aware of have seriously pursued.
I'm going to ask one final question, then open it up to your questions. In the last panel, I was struck when Terry asked what was the responsibility of Canada to help Europe. The answer of at least two of the panelists were none. Europe can deal with its own problems. So I'm going to ask this question in the case of the Americas. So we saw through PIA statistics, and a number of you mentioned it as well, over 2 million apprehensions on the US-Mexico border of people trying to cross that border. We've seen over the last 2 decades, I think, horrible pictures of the treatment of asylum seekers and others who wish to cross the border. What is Canada's responsibility to help people in Central America, South America, the Caribbean, from an America's perspective, or even broader? And what do you think Canadians should do about the humanitarian challenge that is faced by the United States? And I'm going to go from Jeanne over to me.
Right, just don't hate me. No, I really think that, Europe is far away, but the U.S. is and Mexico and all the countries down are much closer. And so really seeing what's the experiences that are happening and the forces that drive migration that are happening in the Americas is everyone's responsibility. So seeing it as each country needs to see itself as a regional player in finding a solution. So it's not one country is responsible for that versus another, but really seeing it as a regional player. In a more immediate sense, to help the U.S. would be to work with the U.S. in addressing. That would be more long term. To address the reasons why people search to uproot their lives, take their families, pay thousands of dollars to coyotes to get them through horrible journeys in search for a hope, not even a good chance, but a hope to find themselves in the United States or Canada. Helping alleviating at least even some pressure in terms of expanding the asylum stream and together educating both the Canadian and the U.S. public about the joint responsibilities that things are being done, and there is a longer-term strategy and solution. So it's not just this crisis, because the underlying driving forces are there. They're not going to go away after tomorrow. So really digging hard on addressing these underlying issues together with the U.S., together with Mexico, and sending countries. Think about Venezuela. It's an amazing example of how initially when Venezuelans started leaving, they were not going to the United States. Initially, they were going to Colombia, to Peru, so to their neighboring countries. As the attitudes in those countries who suddenly faced with a large number of people arriving in a short period of time, one of the panelists mentioned earlier during the European, it's not about the numbers, it's about the pace and how fast people arrive in. So if at that time the US and Canada stepped in the bigger way that they have done to help the neighboring countries to accommodate the flows, to incorporate them, we probably would not have seen that large number of Venezuelans who are trying to make it to the United States, because their options to stay in the region are bad. So they have no choice but try to make it to north. And yes, again, working together and seen as a regional, it's a regional problem to which there is a regional solution or solutions.
Thank you. Sharon?
Sure. I think that a couple of things from like a perspective of as a neighbor, but also as another international superpower Canada can do. I mean, one is working bilaterally and regionally through things like NAFTA and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and particularly the labor side accords. And so one is thinking about the migration flows themselves, but the other is the responsibility that the country has to those migrants. And so I think influence through those channels is important. And at the international level, as a fellow superpower, really modeling, but also holding the U.S. accountable in the ways that it can to the conventions that it hasn't signed on the rights of migrants and the rest. I also think that these are hard things to have high hopes even for Canada about, but conversations again about these sources of pushing migrants out in the form of military interventions and supporting of arms and other places that we see as we speak. And I think that those are, if we want to get real about the long-term displacements, those are responsibilities that global superpowers have jointly. And that means thinking about this not only in the short term about what's happening at the border right now and being reactive to that, but also long term. And we can think of various diasporas that have kind of dual histories in Canada and in the United States. The Salvadoran population, which has here in Montreal a big population, different Caribbean migrants, including Haitians, many of whom have died in frozen tundra at the border trying to cross, and even the Vietnamese who Irene writes about. And so thinking through what went well and what didn't, and modeling. And some people think this is a little overblown, but I think really modeling some of the immigrant integration interventions and kind of shifting. This is the one thing that I think Canada really brings to the conversation, is shifting this away from only an enforcement first conversation, I think is something that we in the United States can learn from. And folks have varying ideas about how optimistic to be about that.
Okay, I'm going to let Anna.
I mean, Canada's not doing anything. So they
But is
should.
that okay?
No, it's not. It's not okay. I don't think it's okay,
Europeans.
but I think it's a really tough question, because Canadians love immigration. We're an immigrant positive country. Why? Because we have this tight, controlled immigration system where we don't have to deal with that kind of crap, right? And so having to deal with the messiness and the difficulty of actually dealing with unplanned migrant inflows would disrupt the delicate balance that allows us to have positive views towards immigration. The reason we have that is because we have a very economic, managed system where immigrants are seen as being for the economy. So that's why I don't think that Canada will do much except for what they signed on in the LA Declaration, which is 4,000 migrants from the region is what they said they will bring in. And they will increase the numbers in their temporary foreign worker program. So it's not okay. I think I agree with everything you all said. There should be bilateral and regional kind of cooperation on this, but I don't think that'll happen.
Yes.
Yeah. It's not so much about Mexico, the US, and Canada, but it's about two countries that have are both quite economically strong facing this challenge. And I think if you look at Australia, outside of New Zealand, a special case, and quite far from Australia, and no shared land border, the way Australia has dealt with large asylum waves is to stockpile them in Indonesia, or to send those asylum seekers to other countries and pay those countries' governments to house them. And Canada doesn't really have that option as much. I think as climate change increases, Australia and possibly Canada will see a lot more inflows of migrants, and we will be less able to maintain this nicely controlled immigration program, and it will create really large political challenges. And bringing in 4,000 seasonal labourers or 4,000 Latin American asylum seekers is really it's going to be insufficient in 10, 20 years' time. So I think this fiction that we're living of a controlled system will quite quickly fall apart, in large part because of climate change.
Pessimistic note. But we now are going to open to your questions. I want to thank everybody for attending this last panel. Merci beaucoup à tous qui sont venus cet après-midi. Please join me in thanking our panelists who have shared their knowledge and their research. I'm going to call up Danielle to finish off the conference, but I, as someone who was part of this conference, also want to give a shout out to all of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada staff and everyone who have helped make this possible. So thank you.